Good day to all of you. This is the first of 8 separate segments on the life of Abraham Lincoln, and we're doing that because of the fact that this is the 200th year of his birth. When I asked after he was nominated for the presidency about his background and his family, he could not go back very far. But we since then have traced his family back to New England in 1637. Seems like a man named Samuel Lincoln left Hingham, England in 1637, crossed the Atlantic, and came to Hingham, Massachusetts in the same year. He was a weaver, and he wasn't too successful financially there in England in his profession. From Samuel Lincoln of Hingham, Massachusetts, the Lincolns would scatter down through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. As we look back in the Lincoln line, we see an Amos Lincoln in 1773 charcoaling his face and hands and throwing tea in Boston Harbor. Captain Abraham Lincoln, the grandfather, had a very good friend and a man named Daniel Boone. And Daniel Boone was always telling him stories about the black earth and the bluegrass and the fur-bearing animals in a place called Kentucky. So he talked Captain Lincoln into leaving Virginia and his farm, taking his wife and children, and coming to the Green River country of Kentucky. That would be in 1782. Now, Captain Lincoln had married a woman whose name was Bathsheba Harrington, and she gave him 3 sons, 2 daughters. There in Kentucky, they filed for 2,000 acres and had to pay $800 for the land. One day in 1786, he was out in his field plowing when some Indians attacked. Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, whom was named, lie dead in the soil. Now, one of the brothers of Thomas Lincoln, Lincoln's father, shot a gun at the Indian and killed him, or else the Indians would have captured all of Captain Lincoln's sons, all 3, taken them as captives and Indianized them. Thomas Lincoln grew up to be 5 foot 9 inches tall, weighed 185 pounds, and would turn into a carpenter. He made excellent cabins and coffins. He roamed about Kentucky, living and doing most of his work in Washington County, Kentucky. One time in his presence, a man was talking rudely about a woman. They got into a fight, and Abraham Lincoln's father, Thomas, bit off the end of the man's nose and spit it out on the ground. And he dearly liked a woman named Sarah Bush, who lived there in the region. But Sarah Bush wanted to marry the jailer of Elizabethtown. So Lincoln's father was jilted by Sarah Bush, but he'll see her again. It said that time you want a woman who, inside the cabin, can cook flapjacks and flip the flapjack up the chimney and run outside the door and catch it before it hits the ground. I'd have to see that kind of woman. But Lincoln saw a tall, dark-haired brunette named Nancy Hanks, 130-pounder who was uneducated, and the word was in whispers she was illegitimate. Her mother bore her through a Virginia man, and they didn't know who the man was, and no one would say. So they married. Nancy Hanks, 23, Thomas Lincoln, 28. They saw their marriage hosted by a friend. They catered a meal there on June 12, 1806, of every kind of meat and food there was. I wonder if Abraham Lincoln was ever told that 6 slaves prepared and carried through the wedding banquet afterwards there at that time. We just recently found the wedding records of that wedding in the Washington County Courthouse in Kentucky. They married, and Lincoln went on to be a carpenter, and they lived in a cabin at Elizabethtown, Kentucky, near the main road. People said later, after they were gone, it was a shack. It was a terrible place to live. But there was born Sarah Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's sister, and she was 2 years older than Abraham Lincoln. And she was born there, and they lived there 18 months. Then he wanted his own land, and so they moved out to a place just a couple miles from Hodgkinsville, Kentucky, that was located as the Great South Fork of the Nolan River. And they called that farm Sinking Spring Farm because there was this huge cave there, a lot of recess back into it, and a spring there continuously dripped. And that's where they got their water. And Abraham Lincoln's mother would take Lincoln there and read the Bible to him and sing to him and talk to him when she went to get water. So one morning in February, Mr. Lincoln sent a runner to go get a woman who could help her have the baby. She was lying on a bed made of bear skins, and corn husks in the corner of the cabin, a very primitive bed there. And it was February, of course, and February 12th, 1809, and the granny woman came, and some neighbors came, and Abraham Lincoln was born on that day, February 12th, 1809, just a few miles from Hodgkinsville. A neighbor boy, 9 years old, came there named Dennis Hanks, very important in Lincoln's life. Asked if he could hold Lincoln, one of the first people ever to hold and look at the baby, and he held him, and Lincoln started crying and screaming and was red as cherry. And Dennis Hanks, at age 9, turned to the people watching and said, he'll never amount to anything because he cried in his arms. So now we have Thomas Lincoln, and we have Nancy Hanks Lincoln, and we have Sarah Lincoln, 2 years older than Abraham Lincoln. They would live there 2 years on that farm. Then they would move 10 miles away from that farm to a place called the Knob Creek Farm. It is there Abraham Lincoln had his first recollections of being born and his activities there. Fishing, hunting, going to dances in the stone houses along the creek, taking the mare and walking to the mill and grinding the grain. His first memories of his life he'd provide for his autobiography. They would stay there at Knob Creek Farm from 1811 to 1816. Abraham Lincoln and Sarah went to school there when their dad would spare them from chores. Total of 4 miles there and back. They went barefooted. It's a blab school. You went there and you recited the multiplication tables, the ABCs, speeches and things to yourself out loud. Very confusing place to go to school. And then, after you thought you knew them, the schoolmasters, Mr. Ryan and Mr. Hazel, would call you up in front of everybody, and then you'd recite what you were supposed to have memorized there. It's a blab school. Everybody blabbed at the same time, total confusion. Teachers weren't qualified. A long walk when they could be spared from the chores. Abraham Lincoln would have, as I'll say many times, a total of 12 to 14 months total schooling in his life. No junior high, no high school, no college. So he got his first education there at that place. He liked to read a great deal, and he liked to borrow books. And his first reading came, of course, in the Bible when his mother read to him. He had a friend there named Austin Gallagher, and they would go out in the woods and chase birds. One day they were chasing these birds, and Knob Creek was in front of them. So they were going to coon it across the log. There's a log across the creek, going to coon it across the log. And Abraham was moving quickly like a raccoon across the log and fell in the creek and would have drowned had not Austin Gallagher reached a branch out and saved his life. We wouldn't have had a 16th president of the United States named Lincoln had not his friend reached a branch out to him there over Knob Creek. They would leave Kentucky because Abraham Lincoln remembered hoeing in the fields. He remembered being taught to use an axe, but he liked getting plant pumpkin seeds in the cornfield with the big boys of the area. He thought that was great fun. But after they planted the seeds, a tremendous rain came, and there were hills all around the farm, and the rain would come down the hills and wash the seeds away. And they got tired of that, so in 1816, the Lincoln family moved to Indiana. Spencer County, Indiana, southwest Indiana, along Pigeon Creek. What is strange, they loaded up everything they had in a wagon, didn't have much, were ferried across the Ohio for a fee, and then father and son Lincoln literally cut their way through the wilderness with axes to get there. There was no road. When they got there in 1816 to southwestern Indiana, Spencer County, Indiana, there was no dwelling. So Abe was a very young boy, and his father built a half-face camp. That's a 3-sided lean-to with brush, logs, limbs. And they lived in that as they built their 18 by 20-foot cabin to move into. This is in winter. They won't move into the cabin until February of 1817. It's very cold. The weather's very bad. And little Sarah and Abe were supposed to keep the fire going on the 4th side of the camp to provide heat for the 3-sided structure. No floor, strange door, and no windows originally there. They would be there in Spencer County, Indiana, along Pigeon Creek until the year 1830. They would spend there 14 years. Lincoln would go from being a sub-teenage boy when he got there to a definition of a man by age 21. Now, the nearest store and people there in Indiana were at Gentryville, about a mile and a half off. There's a general store there, And Lincoln would go there, and he would tell them stories. Of course, his dad was a great storyteller. He would tell them stories, and they would slap their legs and laugh, and he was very renowned for storytelling. But he also would help Mr. Gentry in the store, and he could lift kegs and barrels other men could never lift. So word got out about what a strong chest and arms and legs and back he had, and about his stories there in Indiana. But the weather was bad there in Indiana. It was cold, and they would lose livestock and things like that. It seemed like it'd be on the move again. They called his dad a piddler, a man who just piddled around, never really took anything seriously enough, never had a great profession. One fall day in 1817, a wagon came up in the front yard. It was Elizabeth or Betsy and Tom Sparrow. That's Nancy Hanks, Lincoln's mother's aunt. They had raised her. Since she was illegitimate and didn't know her father, they took her and raised her. And here they come from Kentucky to Indiana to settle down. Elizabeth, but everybody called her Betsy, and her husband Tom. They came there, and Lincoln said, "You can live in the three-face camp since we've got the cabin done." That was in the fall of 1817. About a year later, both Sparrows came down with weakness, vomiting, body aches, and a white tongue. The foster parents, the aunt and uncle of Lincoln's mother, had milk sick. That's where the cows in that area gave milk, but they'd eaten snake root, and the milk was poisonous. And when the Sparrows drank it, it would kill them. Nancy nursed them as best she could, but they both died. They died in their new haven there along Pigeon Creek. So they made coffins, because that's what Lincoln's father did, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the cabin. A few weeks later, Nancy, Lincoln's mom, got sick, white-coated tongue, body aches, all kinds of painful problems. She called Sarah and Abe to her bed and said, "Look, I'm dying." In October of 1818, "I'm dying. And I want you to promise me that you'll be good to your father, that you'll be good to each other, you're good to everybody in the world that you meet." And so Nancy Hanks died, Lincoln's mother. And Dennis Hanks, who had come with the Sparrows, the boy who held Lincoln, said he'd never be anything. He was 17, and 17-year-old Dennis Hanks and Lincoln's dad built a coffin. They built this coffin, and Abraham Lincoln was asked to whittle the white pine pegs to put in it to hold together. Since there were no screws or nails in that part of Indiana. They carried her up her hill, and Lincoln was distressed at age 9 that there was no funeral, no minister there. So he always waited for a minister to come by, and one day he met David Elkhorn, and David Elkhorn said some words over her body. So Lincoln lost his mother. It was hard on Mr. Lincoln, very hard on Mr. Lincoln, because he missed his wife and he was lonely. So Mr. Lincoln told him one day in November 1819, "I'm going back to Elizabethtown. I'm going to leave you two here." He left a 12-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy in a cabin in Indiana in the wilderness, and he went back to find a wife. And he went back to Elizabethtown, and he asked the woman who jilted him to marry him. And now Lincoln had a stepmother, and now there would be 5 kids in the cabin. Now, this woman's name was Sarah Bush. She had jilted Lincoln's dad. They married December 2nd, 1819.